So the first thing that I want you to maybe recognize is that real life is very seldom one straight line of A eats B, B eats C, etc. It's rarely that simple. There's not a lot of organisms who have only one source of food, and then they themselves are the only source of food for the next organism in their food chain. So it's a lot more realistic to talk about a food web. A food web is like a bunch of food chains put together. And the idea is that if I have a food web, there will be more interactions. In a food chain, because things are linear, it's very easy to say, oh, well, if the food source goes away, then that organism will die. But in a food web, it's a little bit trickier. We'll start by talking about the web that's on the left. I'm going to highlight the algae because it is the producer that is in this food web. Now, the algae is the only producer, but that doesn't mean it's the only source of food. The other source of food is down here. It's the result of decay or decomposition. And so in real life, are plants the only thing that could start a food chain? Not necessarily, because the plant might not actually be part of it. It might be the remains of the plant that are left behind. The next thing that I would point out is that depending on what they're eating, organisms will be classified differently. So for example, this tadpole over here would be a primary consumer because it is eating the producer. It's very easy to classify that one because there's only one interaction for it. But now I'm going to point your attention over here to this one. It's a kookaburra, it's a bird. Now the kookaburra is eating a bunch of different organisms. So if we follow the lines, the kookaburra is eating the frog. The kookaburra is also eating the centipede. So if I want to classify the kookaburra, I have to ask myself, what are the classifications of the organisms that it's eating? So we'll start with the centipede. We'll call the centipede a primary consumer because it's eating the food source. So it's not directly a plant, but it's the remains of possibly a plant. In this line then, if I follow it up to the kookaburra, it's a secondary consumer because it's eating the primary consumer. But let's say now that I follow the line from the frog. Now the frog is eating a couple of different things as well. The frog, for example, is eating the ant. The ant, for example, it's going to be hard for me to follow these little lines here. The ant is eating the sedge, and the sedge was eating the algae. So in that particular little path, I would say producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary, so fourth level, fourth order. So I can't say that that kookaburra is one particular level of consumer because it depends on what it's eating. Now I could go ahead and I could do the same thing and instead of following the frog to the ant, I could follow the frog to the dragonfly. It would be approximately the same answer. Now according to this food web, that organism would be called a carnivore because there's no place in the food web that shows that the kookaburra is directly eating a plant. But like someone asked during the daily review, that doesn't mean that it couldn't. That just means that in this particular representation, The only thing that it's showing that it's eating are animals, so it would have to be classified as a carnivore. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about that? So the other thing I'll mention is that there are so many interactions that happen in real life that I can't expect you to know them all. So if I were to ask you a question about interactions and food webs, I would either give you a food web to look at so that you can see what I'm talking about, so give you a picture representation, or I would talk about a scenario that you are probably familiar with. I tend to pick organisms that are close to home. So for example, I use things that live in the forest a lot, like bears that eat berries or bears that eat fish, because it's something that's familiar to you. The other thing I want you to notice, just as a bit of a technicality, is that not all food chains or food webs are drawn the same way. In this particular one, it says that if you follow the arrow, that's who is eating it. In this food web on the right, if you follow the arrows, I'll just make a little legend here. It's the other way around. A is eating B. And it just depends on who decided to draw the artwork. So there is no incorrect way to represent as long as you indicate who is eating who or which direction things are going in. The food chain that I have over here is very similar to this one. I'll just point out a couple of things on this one. There's the two types of plankton at the bottom, and I just want to remind you, phytoplankton are producers. Zooplankton are primary consumers because they are generally eating the phytoplankton. Zoo represents animal, phyto represents light. So the phytoplankton are like little plants, and the zooplankton are like little animals. Now, does anyone want to ask any questions about any of that? So I'd like for you to take a minute and looking at the food chain that's on the right now, tell me what level or levels you think the puffin, the rat, and the auklet are. All right, I'll go through this example and just show you how I would figure this out. I'll start with the puffin. Based on what the puffin is eating, I can say that there are, in pretty much every case, two levels between it and the producer. So if I look at what the puffin is eating, it's eating the salmon, the cephalopod, or the sand lice. All of them are eating the zooplankton, and the zooplankton is eating the phytoplankton. So if I were to follow that path, that makes all of these things secondary consumers, and the puffin a third level consumer. Now if I were to do the same thing for the rat, I have to consider what it is eating. The rat eats in sort of this pathway. So if I follow that, the rat is eating the kittiwake, which is eating the sand lance, which is eating the zooplankton, which is eating the phytoplankton. I just said that the sand lance was a second order consumer, which makes this a third, which makes the rat a fourth order consumer. If I were to follow other pathways, for example over here, it's eating different organisms. So the phytoplankton is the producer, zooplankton is the primary consumer, auklet is secondary, gull is third order, and rat is still fourth order. So even though it's eating different organisms in that path, we would still say that it's a fourth order consumer. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask about that? Yes, Jade. So if we were to follow this path, so from rat to seagull to bird, then we would sort of come down this pathway here and follow the sand lines. So we'd have consumer 1, consumer 2, consumer 3, consumer 4. So we could make the case that the rat is consumer 5 in that one. So what I want you to recognize realistically is it depends who else is in the food chain. We would never be able to say a rat is always a 4th order consumer or the rat is always a 5th order consumer. It just happens to be in this picture, but that doesn't mean it is everywhere all the time. The last one we'll do is the auklet then. We kind of already answered it because one of the other organisms went through it. But it realistically has to be a 2nd order consumer because in this picture the only thing that it's eating is zooplankton, and zooplankton is the primary consumer. So sometimes there's more than one answer. Sometimes, like with the rat, you can get the same answer more than one way, or sometimes there are 2 answers. Does anyone want to ask anything else about this? So the last thing that we need to talk about is this. If you have printed notes, this is in the notes. If you don't, maybe you want to write it just on the back of the sheet that I gave you. It's probably not news to you what this principle is. Now you'll notice I wrote 3 different words there because quite frankly, it really depends who wrote the thing that you're reading. Bioaccumulation, I think, would be the best word for us to use because accumulation is really what's happening, but I have heard it called biological amplification, magnification. I even hear it called just biomagnification, bioamplification. So there's a bunch of ways that this topic can be referred to. But the definition would be this: the buildup of chemicals. Now I wrote toxic chemicals because we generally only care about this principle if something bad is building up. If something that is not harmful is building up, there's not a lot of study done on it. So I put the word toxic there. That doesn't mean that non-toxic chemicals cannot accumulate, just that they don't have these nefarious side effects. So it's the buildup of toxic chemicals in organisms as tissues containing the chemical move through the food chain. So what would these tissues be? Anything with carbs, fats, or proteins in it, because those are the molecules that get passed from one organism to the next in a food chain. So if at any point a cell that contains the carbohydrate or a cell that contains fat or a cell that contains protein also contains some toxic chemical, it's very probable that the next animal up in the food chain is going to eat it. The reason that it's a big deal is because very often the chemicals that we consider toxic get absorbed by fat tissue, and then they stay in an organism's body. The organism won't excrete them, so they won't get filtered, let's say, out of blood. You won't breathe them out. You won't ingest them through your digestive system, but they'll get absorbed by fatty tissue and stay. Now my example over here illustrates DDT, so this might be an example that you've heard of before. DDT as a toxin is particularly well documented in sort of marine aquatic ecosystems, finishing with a large bird of prey. At the bottom, we have our producers who are likely in the water. And so the water is where the DDT would be found. And these producers, because there's so many of them and there's so much water, have a very small concentration. So that's what this measure is. It is a concentration. Now this isn't Chem 20. I'm not going to ask you to calculate parts per million. That's not my goal. But what you should recognize is that that number goes up every time we go up a level in the food chain. The reason that concentration increases is because the number of organisms, the number of organisms in each level decreases. So I don't have more of the toxic chemical, I just have less place to put it. So it's not like the toxic chemical is like multiplying and making more copies of itself. It's just that when you have a lot of organisms and the toxin can be spread out, you don't notice it a lot. But then you go up a level in the food chain and you have less organisms, so you notice it a bit more. And you go up a level in the food chain and there's less organisms, so you notice it more. Very frequently, when you're at the top of a food chain, like this bird of prey up here, there are very few organisms in your level of that particular food chain. Birds of prey are fairly solitary. Sometimes in a given food chain, there would be one of them. Like it lives by itself, hunts by itself, so it is the only organism at the top of its food chain. Now, the thing with DDT, and we'll read about this, is that it affected the shells of the eggs that these birds were laying. It made them too soft, and so that really impacted survival of the next generation of birds.